So something I get asked by students pretty regularly, and something that seems to be a pretty large source of confusion in the church today, is what is God's name? Is it Jehovah or is it Yahweh? A lot of people seem to be confused about which one is actually the name of God. And so in this video, I'm going to tell you which one it is. But I'm not just going to tell you which one is correct if you go by the Bible. I'm also going to give you the history of this controversy. It's not really a controversy, but this source of confusion that exists in the church. I'm going to tell you how we got from God's name being pretty solid and finite in Scripture to there being this other option that people say is God's name, even though it's really not. So by the end of this, if you stick with me through this entire video, you will not only know for certain what God's name is in the Bible, the one that he revealed to Moses, you'll also know why there's so much confusion about it. And hopefully you'll be able to help others have assurance about what God's name actually is in the Bible. So the first thing you need to know is that God's name is not G-O-D, God. The word God is an English title that we use to refer to God. It comes from the Hebrew word Elohim, which is the Hebrew plural word for God, but it's the version of that title that is used to refer to the one true God all throughout Scripture. Now, there are other titles that are used all throughout the Bible to refer to God. In fact, I think there's over 70 titles in the Bible that are used to speak of the one true God. And even though sometimes you'll see these things online like 30 names of God in the Bible or 50 names of God in the Bible, there aren't 50 names of God. God has only one name. So El Shaddai, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord, these are all ways of referring to God, but they are not actually his name. God's name, as revealed in Scripture, is the Hebrew word Yahweh. Okay, it's comprised of 4 Hebrew letters, Yod, He, Vav, He. Yahweh. It's not Jehovah, it's Yahweh. When God went to his servant Moses in Exodus chapter 3 and told Moses that he was calling him to leave being a shepherd and that God was going to send him back to Egypt to lead his people out of slavery, Moses asked God a question. He said, if I go back to Egypt and I return to the people of Israel and I say to them that the God of our fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? And God responded to Moses by revealing to him what his name is. This is the first place in Scripture where God reveals his name to a man. In fact, it's the only place in Scripture where God reveals his name to a man. And what God says to Moses is this: I am who I am. I will be who I will be. That is a loose translation of the Hebrew word Yahweh, which is God's name all throughout Scripture. Now, what God actually said to Moses was, my name is 𝗎𝗓, which is the first person singular form of the name Yahweh. But all through Scripture, when God's name is used, mentioned, revealed, it's always the 4 Hebrew consonants, Yod, He, Vav, He, which make up the singular absolute form of the name itself. Now, in order to understand why so many people think that God's name is Jehovah and how we even got to where Jehovah is a thing in the church, you need to learn some of the backstory and some of the history of the Hebrew language, both how it's written and how it's pronounced. So stick with me for the next few minutes because I'm going to tell you all the important things you need to know about Hebrew in order to understand how we got from Yahweh to Jehovah. So the first thing you need to know about the Hebrew language is that it is an inflected language. In other words, ancient Hebrew or original Hebrew did not have vowels in the alphabet. It was a consonantal language, meaning it was only consonants and there were no vowels. The vowel sounds were spoken when one was speaking or reading Hebrew, but they were inflected, meaning A person who spoke native Hebrew could read the words, which were only consonants, and make the vowel sounds because they knew the language. But this is why foreigners for many, many years and generations had such a hard time learning to read Hebrew. Because even if you could understand the words, if you weren't a native speaker, it was sometimes hard to look at just the consonants and know what word was being used because the vowels are all inflected. Now, even if you go to modern Israel today, where they speak modern Hebrew, a lot of times if you're reading street signs or any sort of public writing, there's no vowels. Sometimes there are vowels included, but the vowels, in many cases, are not included in the words. So you have to be a native speaker in order to really look at a word or look at a sentence and know what's being said. When were the Hebrew vowels that we read in the Hebrew Bible invented? Well, that started around the 6th century AD, but I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. The second thing you need to know about the Hebrew language is that God's name is never spoken in Hebrew. So the first thing that you learn when you learn Hebrew in Bible school or seminary is that if you're reading along in the Hebrew Bible and you come across God's name, YHWH, 4 Hebrew consonants, you don't pronounce that word. You don't vocalize it. What you're taught to do when you see the word Yahweh written on the page is to instead say Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for Lord. The Hebrew word for Lord is Adonai. And when you read Yahweh in Hebrew, that's the word that you say. And this tradition has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. As far as I know, it predates Jesus' own life. Now, whether I think it's right that Jewish people, when they're speaking Hebrew, don't mention the Lord's holy name, Yahweh, whether I agree with that or not is a completely different story. But what you need to know is when you're reading Hebrew and you come across the name Yahweh, you don't say it. You say Adonai. The third thing you need to know about the Hebrew language is that there are some differences in pronunciation between ancient Hebrew and modern Hebrew. So in modern Hebrew, there are 3 letters, at least I would say, that are pronounced very differently than they were in ancient Hebrew. And the first letter is the letter that makes the sound wa or va. In ancient Hebrew, the letter wow, which made a W sound originally, is now in modern Hebrew translated as vav. Vav. So instead of making a W sound, it makes more of a V sound. It went from wa to va. Now, the second letter that's pronounced differently today than it was back in ancient Hebrew is the letter Y or Yod in ancient Hebrew. Now, Yod is still called Yod in modern Hebrew today, and as far as I know, people who speak modern Hebrew still pronounce the yah sound, but there was a time in history where that yah sound was pronounced more like a J sound, ja, ja. So yah was pronounced ja, and just so you know, there is no J or even J sound in the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, so now that you understand those 3 facts, that there are different pronunciations between ancient and modern Hebrew, that you never, ever, ever say the Lord's name when you're reading Hebrew or if you're speaking with Jewish people, and the fact that ancient Hebrew was a consonantal language where the vowel sounds were inflected, not written, we can move on. The next thing you need to understand is this. The Hebrew vowel system that currently exists today and is there in the Hebrew Bible, if you learn Hebrew and start reading the Old Testament in Hebrew, you'll see that there's vowels everywhere. That vowel system, which is called the Hebrew pointing system, was invented by the Tiberian Masoretes starting in the 6th century AD. And they were around from about the 6th to 11th century AD. And their job, and they were known as very, very, very excellent scribes, was to preserve the original Hebrew scriptures. We actually have older copies of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was started in the 2nd to 3rd century BC, than we do of the original Hebrew Old Testament. But what we do have are the Masoretic texts, which are very, very, very well preserved. So when the Tiberian Masoretes invented a vowel system or a pointing system for Hebrew, it was with the purpose of allowing people who didn't speak ancient Hebrew to learn it and to be able to read the Old Testament in its original language. And what they did was they went and they added vowels to almost every Hebrew word in existence so that people who were reading it would know how to pronounce the words, the original words that didn't have any vowels with them originally. But one word they did not add vowels to was the word Yahweh, the holy name of God. Why did they not add vowels to the name Yahweh originally? Because God's name is holy. If you're not going to speak it, you're certainly not going to alter it by adding vowels to it. It's a holy name. So the pronunciation of God's name, 𝗎𝙬𝙎, still remained a mystery for many, many, many years. Because if you were just to come across 4 letters, 𝗎𝙬𝙎, like YHWH, how would you pronounce that? Would you even know how to pronounce that? I'll never forget the first time I was taking Hebrew in seminary and I came across the word Yahweh on a flashcard and I looked at it and I said, I have no idea how to pronounce this word. Yeah, and I tried. I went, Jehovah, but there were no vowels on the card. So when I flipped it over and I realized it was the Tetragrammaton, God's holy name, it all made sense. This is why people don't pronounce the name. This is why the name is holy and there were no vowels added to it. Because on its own, if you don't add the vowels, it's really, really tough to pronounce unless you're taught how to do so. So with that in mind, let me tell you about how Yahweh eventually became pronounced as Jehovah. And now there seems to be 2 different versions of God's name in the English language, Yahweh or Jehovah, even though God only has one name, and it's Yahweh. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, I want to encourage you to visit our website, thatyoumayknowhim.com. There you will find all of our past videos, all of our past podcast episodes, and our podcast series cataloged and categorized, as well as our blog, Coffee with God, where you'll find Bible studies, devotions, and biblical and theological articles, all for free. We don't charge for anything whatsoever on our website. I started this ministry back in 2021, and if you feel led to do so, we would love your support. Every little bit helps. $20 a month, $10 a month, even $5 a month goes a long way to helping us accomplish our mission of illuminating biblical truth, applying it to faith, life, and culture, so that you can know and love and walk with Jesus like never before. Originally what happened was early English Bible translators like William Tyndale were trying to figure out what to do with the name Yahweh. They weren't just going to transliterate it into English, 𝗎𝙬𝙎, but they also knew about this tradition of not pronouncing it. There also were never any vowels attached to the name when they were reading the original Masoretic texts. So they didn't really know what to do with the name Yahweh, because even if they were going to try and transliterate it, they didn't know how to pronounce it properly. Well, eventually what happened was the vowels that were associated with the word Adonai, which again is the Hebrew word for Lord, were taken and added to the 4 Hebrew consonants 𝗎𝙬𝙎. So you take that A sound for Adonai, and you add that just under the Y in the word Yahweh, and now you have Yah. Well, everything's good so far, but then the next letter, the next vowel, I should say, Adonai, sort of got off track. You went from having Yahweh to Yahho, and that second hey, or that second H sound in the name Yahweh, which was sort of a breathing sound before, Yahweh became a very pronounced ho sound. Yahho. And then, of course, the Yahweh, the W sound from the Hebrew Vav, Wah, Yahweh, started to be pronounced as a V sound with an A after it. So Yahweh became Yahovah instead. Now you have Yahweh being pronounced like Jehovah, and pretty soon you have Jehovah being written and transcribed as God's holy name. I think all the way up till like the 17th, 18th century, most people who used the name Jehovah, we're talking about some really prominent scholars and preachers, didn't really understand that this mix-up had taken place. And so they were saying Jehovah just like it was the name that was revealed in Scripture, Yahweh, even though that pronunciation is completely off. That is not how you say God's name. Jehovah, no. God's name is YHWH, and it's pronounced Yahweh. So that's eventually what happened. Hebrew was given a vowel system around the 6th, 7th century AD, although the name Yahweh was not given any vowels, and it went from being not vocalized to then being vocalized using the vowels that go along with the Hebrew word Adonai, which simply means Lord. So I hope this was a helpful video. I know there was a ton of information shared in this and a lot of history, but the most important thing you need to remember is this: God only has one name, and it is comprised of 4 Hebrew letters, Yod, He, Vav, He. To the best of our knowledge, it's pronounced Yahweh. And if someone tells you that God's name is Jehovah, it's not like you have to heat check them and say, no, it's not Jehovah. It's just, that's not how God's name is vocalized or pronounced. And the fact that we've taken a mispronunciation based on the amalgamation and really the confusion of multiple different languages and sort of slapped it all together and then made this new name that we write in English, Jehovah. Look, that's just not God's name. God's name is Yod He Vav He, Yahweh. And if you want to write it in English, all you have to do is write 4 letters, YHWH. So if you have questions, I hope you'll leave them in the comment section below. I can't wait to read your comments. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you feel like you have the confidence to really say for sure what God's name is, because there's no doubt if you go read it in the Hebrew Bible, it's Yahweh. Yod He Vav He. Thanks for watching. My name's Blake, and over the past 20 years, I've been a missionary, a pastor, and a Bible college and seminary professor. During that entire time, I've been teaching the Bible. And if you want more Bible content to come your way, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. And also, check out this video right here.